Chapter 11. The monster grinds along a winding mountain trail. Its body is long and creaks through the many twists and rocky turns. It is constructed of wood and flesh, and it locomotes on leg and wheel. At its end is the backside of a creaking cart festooned with the creatures of the sea. Nymphs swim through the whirls of its wood, and seahorses, and spiraling whales. Hammered into the wood are clamps and latches onto which are secured pipes and pipettes, pumps and vials, and coils of marine tubing. Above the cart, rising 10 feet into the air, is a swaying load. It is held by a giant swath of blue tarpaulin, secured by rope netting and ratchet strap, and inside it are the leavings of the old abalone farm of Mocha Fisheries Incorporated. Pump and sealant, and filtration system and lumber, and reef mix and hydrometer and woodworking equipment, saw and nail and hammer and measure. While the abdomen that rises high is constructed of cart and rubber and metal, the head of the monster is flesh and bone. A bear of a man is strapped into the contraption, and step by step he drags it across the peak. His eyes are dark and focused not on the mountain turning before him, but rather on the past. The trail is an artery running toward the history of his own heart. Each turning is known to him. He has made use of it 3 times. The first was when he traveled to the Bay as a young man, where his new life began. And then twice more he used this road to mark the passing of the dead. It is their memory that drives him, and so he follows a wild plan. Behind him, deep in the center of the wooden cart that he discovered under tarp at Jono's beach, is a sealed tank in which oxygen pumps and ocean water sloshes. Within that bubbling water lie the dark shapes of bivalves, their shells ajar and their whiskers examining the gloom. There are 12 of them, clams that he has already harvested, their pearls buried safely in the felt behind the boy's hut, clams ready to be impregnated and to grow their fine pearls again. They are fragile. Without antibiotics and proper filtration, they will die, and all of his plans with him. They are like lungs breathing, lending oxygen to his dreams, and so he knows he must push hard day and night. As he toils in a world of pain, one sensation brings sweetness. As light as gossamer she is laid across his shoulders. She is dead to the world, moaning fitfully as the rocky track jars her through his shoulders. It is she that reminds him to tread carefully, to not abandon himself to exhaustion, her moans that bring him back to the world when exhaustion attempts to pull him away. He rests when his body demands it, simply grinding to a halt and with relief reaching up to unclasp the hitch of the yoke at his sternum, taking pleasure in sinking to the unforgiving rock and taking nourishment from the solidity of the mountain. His means of unloading her are always the same. He leans down so that his forehead nearly touches the rock and scoops his hand up behind his neck. Then he gently wipes her from his shoulder and lets her slide across his back and arm to the earth. He cradles her head before it touches rock and places a burlap sack beneath it. Sometimes during their rest she lies dead and unseeing, and other times, precisely which he has forgotten within the merging of this relentless walk, her eyes flutter open, and once again he peers into those green pools. At times he finds himself staring at a wall of rock himself, and realizes he was out of the world, dead on his feet. But mostly he tends to her. Her legs have swollen even further, becoming grotesque worms. Water splashed from the tank does wonders on her skin, but he cannot risk the health of his clams, and so he turns to the seal lard stored in an old paint tin at the side of the cart. As they rest in the middle of the road with the load of the cart rising over them, he rubs the lard into her, whether it is by day with the sun beaming down, or by night when the stars wheel and leopards stalk the dark. As the journey progresses, so he feels the creature sinking deeper. "You were not built for this place," he rumbles as he trudges. "You were built for the cold and the deep. You should have stayed there." But despite his sentiment, he squeezes her calf, wanting her to feel comfort. "Stay with me. Soon. I will bring you water. Our place is beautiful. You will see." It will heal you." And he looks ahead once more and permits himself to smile in his solitude, for he was born on the mountain. The rock brings him comfort, and he is going home. It is late afternoon on the third day when he knows that they are close. He remembers this turn in the track well. It is an alcove where a little olive tree grows, positioned beside the track, seeming to spring from the bare rock as a perfect miniature, but with no discernible soil from which it grows. He remembers studying this fantastic creature for the first time, 20 years ago, marveling at its ability to burrow through rock. He remembers discovering its secret. He goes nearer, and once again finds the hidden overhang. He sees the little pool of soil there, into which the roots of the tree have twisted. Once again he traces them as they climb through the air to form the hardy tree above. "You are truly magic," he says to the little plant. "I am so glad to see you again." Half an hour later, Uncle Mike finally stops, placing one hand against the sheer cliff beside him, while with the other he steadies the creature on his shoulder. Here it lies, a little lake, nestled in the rising buttresses of the mountain. Here it lies, this place that is his heart. The trail ahead peels off and down to meet the water's edge. There the pool lies deep and cold, its edges ruffled by a waterfall on the far side that tumbles from the cliff face above. From where he stands, the trail tracks round to the left, rising to the same cliff. To his right and to the west, after the waterfall, the cliff gives way to a pocket of korea and ash trees, an unexpected forest this high up that rings that portion of the pool. His eyes linger on the trees. If this hidden lake in the mountains is a home, the trees are its heart. He breathes deep, and then with an effort he turns his eyes away. The trees will be his reward. First, there is work to be done. He unhitches the yoke and gently slides the creature from his shoulder. With her in his arms, he tramps down to the water's edge, careful over bare rock coated with the waterfall's mist. He kneels to lay her at the edge, and then he goes down to his knees beside her. He kisses the rock. "Thank you." He stands. He removes his clothes and feels once again what it is to be free in the mountain. The waterfall rushes, and doves and weavers call. He takes up the creature and steps into the water. It climbs to his waist and higher, where now it touches her body also. She shivers like a fish. He continues, letting the water rise till it covers him all the way to his shoulders, and she floats 7 feet above the grim rock below. He stands quietly, drinking every detail. The cliffs rise bare and full of ledges. There is bashful life up there. Rock rabbits shelter in cracks, and frogs peer from the pool. The peace of the place flows into him. This water, this precious water. Again a shiver runs through her body. He waits. Suddenly, she kicks away from him. He watches. She is not yet awake, but he can see that in some way she is aware. And then she opens her green eyes. She sees blue sky and around it a ring of rock pierced by a waterfall. She drifts, and then there is the feel of flesh against her ankle. His hand. She turns to see his face. His dark hair is plastered to his forehead, and his dark beard and moustache gleam with water. She flicks herself away, circling out into the lake, little twists of her hands taking her further. As the water washes her, so slices of memory return. Pain as she rode upon his shoulders, his bone and muscle digging into her, and pain as she lay on the rock, and fever. She looks around at the trees and the sheer rock and the wide calm of the water. She licks her tongue across her upper lip. The water is sweet. He is watching her. She cannot read his expression, and she wants nothing to do with his thoughts. She wants to pulse her fin and dive, but her legs trail beneath her, useless. Like a bear he begins to swim, his arms and legs paddling below and only his face above. She gives him a wide berth. He stops in the center of the lake, treading water. He casts his eyes up to the cliff, staring for a moment, and then he dives and disappears. She looks to the cliff. She sees nothing but rock rearing above her. She does not like this place of heights. She peers through the surface of the water, looking for him below. Down there it is dark, the shade from the cliff making the water black. She takes a breath, still unused to the need to fill her lungs, and tips herself over. Underneath she finds rocky walls sloping down. Here, weed grows from deeper soil. Some luminous and some pale, they drift in the murmuring sunlight. Between them fly new kinds of fish. A long grey creature with black eyes traverses the weeds, biting at the stalks, and another, mottled green and brown. This one bulges behind the head, a fat torso tapering back to a slender tail with fins frilled like an eel. It passes her, its body snaking through the water. She drifts halfway down, flying once again, free once again. A white boulder rears from the weed below. She senses movement. Below the boulder something is rising, and then he appears. He climbs up to her, one hand scooping water while the other is a fist punching ahead, a smile splitting the granite of his face. She turns to watch as his huge form breaks the surface. Bubbles explode around him and light refracts. Here below there is peace for her, but soon she feels a burning in her chest and limbs. She examines it, this pain, and then her lungs begin to pump against her closed gills. The sensation drives her to the dancing silver up there, and she breaks clear. She floats with her face to the sky, breathing in the mist of the waterfall. She turns her face from the spray, and there he is, treading water. He extends his hand to her and opens his fingers. There are 2 brown freshwater clams in his palm, only a third of the size of those from her cave. He presses the little creatures into her fingers, and then turns and strikes out to the shore. In the hot sun, Uncle Mike sets to work. Ever since he hatched this plan 4 days before, he has been preparing for this moment of arrival. His first goal is to separate the cart from the load as easily as possible. First, he unclips the ratchet strap that bisects the bulging blue tarpaulin. He pulls the strap away so that it hisses to the ground, leaving the previously taut tarp to sag to the pressure of the equipment within. Next, he turns to the several clamps that he has sunk into the wood of the cart. He releases them, freeing the netting that he has crisscrossed over the load. The bulge above begins to lean towards him. Uncle Mike allows it to slide onto his chest. He grunts, taking a step backwards, swaying with it. His face grows red as he shifts the weight sideways, angling for the cliff wall beside him. There he wedges the load against the rock, and assisted by the friction of the wall, he bends until he is seated on the ground. Here in this sliver of shade the aroma is of moist earth and distant sun and mossy rock. He shifts the tower sideways, allowing it to slide onto the earth also. His hands are smeared with soil. With the load removed, he returns to the cart. His solar panel is still attached to the yoke, and he retrieves it, examining the fine connecting wires. They are unbroken, the panel seems undamaged, and the whir of the little Jabal pump inside the sealed tank confirms that the unit is functioning well. He pops the lid of the compartment, revealing stirring water and the shapes of the dark clams. They are bunched up. He knows he must get them out and into the sun as soon as he can to allow them to feed. He knows that he must construct them a new home by morning. To deprive them of space and light for any longer will mean the end. He looks up to the sun now hovering above the cliff on the track side of the lake. In 30 minutes this little bowl will be in shadow, and 2 hours after that it will be too dark to see. Even though he has only slept in snatches the last 3 nights, now is not the time for rest. He drags the cart out of the shadow of the cliff. At least the clams in the top layer will eat the day's last light. He turns to the load still trussed in the tarpaulin. Inside he has the recirculation system for one of Mokka's abalone pits, which he will modify to his purposes, and he has 20 kilograms of Fritz reef mix to salt the water in which he will grow his creatures. He cannot waste time. He must construct the tank in which the clams will lie separate from the lake, and the recirculation chamber, and then he must fill the tank and sand it and salt it, and then he must place his clams in their new home so that they can begin to feed on the rising sun. All of this by morning. When that is done, he must build the second tank, for the bai will not be saved unless they can breed. On impulse he turns to the silent water behind him, looking for the creature. But the lake is empty, and the cliff stares back. He looks to the tangle of trees on the western shore. Nothing. She will come to him. There is nowhere else for her to go. First, he must complete his task. He turns to the load and begins. That night, the clatter of Uncle Mike's generator echoes across the pool, bouncing from the sheer cliffs and sailing up into the night. 2 of his work lights are strung up from the cart. They cast a pool of white light in which he toils. Unused to the noise, the creatures of the pool look on. The rock rabbits peer from their ledges and the frogs watch from the shallows, while from beneath the waterfall, she is watching him also, and drinking his thoughts. She cannot look away. He stalks through the jumble of his building site. Sheets of wood lie scattered as he cuts them to shape with a giant blade, and as time flows through the night he assembles what seems to be some kind of box, growing on the rocky shore. He saws and hammers and paints, and at times sits staring at the stars, and then begins again. All through the night she watches him work, seeing him grow gaunt. It is near to morning when suddenly the clatter of the little generator disappears. The silence is shocking. She sees his head jerk up at the sudden calm, and then turn to the east where faintly the outline of the mountain can be seen. He shakes his great head and strides to the scattered pile of his belongings. He bends and then a beam of light comes arcing from his hand. With the torch he returns to his work, spreading paint over the box he has built, over and over. She shifts in the water, drawing on the peace of the liquid and the mayhem of the life of the riverbank. Here are roots twisting through soil and branches twisting through air, and the breathing of the weavers and the doves, and frogs and snakes and fish. She is aware of them all. Their dreaming settles on her shoulders. Her fingers curl among the roots. Morning has risen by the time his tank is complete. He cannot comprehend the night's labor. From the moment he made the decision to leave the Baha'i, he had known how crucial this night would be. He had set himself the target of placing the clams by morning, this being the 4th day of them having had no sun from which to feed. But he had also known that his goal was unlikely, perhaps impossible, just as pulling the cart over the mountain was impossible. And now he sits beside a tank that is not yet ready. He has coated the whole structure with sealant. It is quick drying, but he knows it will still be hours before he can home the clams. He shakes his tired head. What he needs is space for his clams to breathe, and space for them to feel the sun and eat it. And he needs salt water. He shakes his tired brain. Something is pulling at him, some idea. Suddenly he jerks upright. The top! Again he shakes his head, washing the fog away. He had earmarked the top for use later as a seedbed and initially as a rain cover, but he could just as easily use it now. Stupid, he mutters, smacking his ear and rising. He lumbers to his materials, seeing clearly a vision of what he must do. The big blue tarp spread inside the still drying tank, forming a tank within a tank, so that the still wet epoxy can dry beneath. As he stumbles to the tank with the tarp trailing behind him, the sun crests the cliff above. He shivers. Yes, this is what they all need. Sun. It will be a miracle if they survive. He mutters as he begins spreading the tarp inside the tank. He is aware of every potential pitfall, from infection to leakage to recirculation to incorrect salination, and yet he continues. They will survive, he tells himself as he spreads the heavy tarp. They must. Night. She is within the lake, her back to the cliff directly across from his campsite. Only her head is above the water that has become her home. She has eaten the fish of the lake. She has rested in its womb, and she is refreshed. And she watches. The box the man has built is barely visible in the night, as is his body that lies seemingly dead, half in and half out of the water, his face to the rock. His snores rumble in the water. Moonrise. She looks to the orb rising above the cliff. Tonight it will be full, and there will be shadows. Eat, she sounds, as she pushes off into the lake. The deep water is glorious, as are the creatures turning within. Her goal is the box lying stark and square on the rock. She glides through the dark water, approaching it and the sleeping man. She can see now that he lies on his cheek with his face towards her. His eyes are folded away beneath the deep wrinkles of his eyelids and the labor of the last few days. His face is swollen, his cheeks rashed with new beard, his mouth like a fruit, crumpled and parted. His chin is caught between the bone of his skull, the mountain beneath it, and the pad of his shoulder. Her fingers touch the bottom of the lake. She slides toward him in the water. There is much she wants to see. She crawls, dripping from the lake, keeping the box between her and him. She looks inside it. The tarpaulin tumbles around its lip. Carefully she walks beside it, using her hands on it to take the weight off of her shattered legs. She had watched him toil all afternoon, lifting buckets from the lake and splashing them into his bed of tarp while his machine assisted, splurging the water from the lake into the deepening aquarium. She watched him spooning powder into the box and saw him taking measurements with a metal object as he rode his weariness. She saw him scowl and calculate and hesitate at the amount of powder he added. And finally he had sat and sunk his head between his knees, and then with weariness stood and began removing the clams from the cart and placing them into the new water. And now she looks into that water as the moon rises, and within it she sees 12 of them at rest. Her clams. As the moonlight enters the water, 2 open their shells, tasting this memory of the sun. She is near the far end of the box where a noisy machine whirs. 2 dark snakes extend from it into the water, and from them a current circulates throughout the tank. She understands. The clams need movement. Water must pass through their gills. She puts her finger into the water, and then her hand. She reaches down to place her palm on the shell of the clam below her. The animal is dying. Its thoughts are faint and growing fainter. All are dying. She leans forward, letting her arm and then her torso and then her whole body slide into the water. The salt of it is soothing. She takes a breath and sinks beneath. Immediately the sound of the pump is altered, echoing within her head, thumping, booming, and the thoughts of her clams come to her more strongly. She lays her body on top of them, touching all with her bare flesh. She trails her fingers across them, caressing their open mouths and exposed mantles, stirring them back to life. The feet of the clams emerge, tasting their mother. She sings to them, and in her ears, slowly, they begin to sing in return. My children are hungry. And she feeds them. A wave rises from her womb and surges through her. It washes against her throat and sucks with the tide back to her center, where it circulates. She parts her legs and a milky cloud trails from her into the water, bathing the lips of each exposed clam. She croons, singing to the plankton as they settle and fill her children with the nutrients they need. Lovingly she arranges them, turning their mouths to the coming sun, orientating them to the current as is their preference, and soothing them with her care. Their feet dance in the moonlight. As the clams are enriched by their mother, so she is enriched by them. She opens her eyes beneath the water and allows tears to flow, sending waves of song to take the tears and wipe them across every smiling mantle and every dancing foot. She croons at the pleasure of home. She stays this way for hours, singing with her children, breathing nothing but them. As dawn nears, it is time to leave. She sighs and gathers herself, readying herself for the weight of the world out there. She lowers her feet to the bottom of the tank and stands, rising into the frigid night air. She had almost forgotten it, this new world. She stands dripping beneath the moon, and she is grateful. She looks up to the heavens, and despite the glow of the moon up there, some of the stars still shine. Near the horizon is the belt of the hunter. She looks for the scorpion, craning her neck to find its sting, but it is not yet raised in the still summer skies. She drinks the stars, and is glad they did not take her that night on the mountain. They are her friends. They are the memory of her love. She sighs. How will she find him in this endless and uncertain place? She cannot hear him. She cannot feel him. The abyss between them is great. She wonders if he is gone from her. Will she ever see him again? She sends her question to the stars, and they answer, yes. She nods at the truth of it, at the truth of the solidity of her own body and her own breath plunging through her. She looks to her left where the man lies on the ground, taking the opportunity to study him up close without his knowing. His head is turned away from her. She studies the line of cropped hair against his neck, the intimacy of his ear turned to the moon, the skin behind it. She listens to his labored breathing, the snore sawing from his obstructed throat. There are scars on his back. Their pucker shines wet beneath the moon. They twist across him, innumerable cuts and ridges collected over the years. His right arm is thrust toward her, laying dead across the rock of the mountain, the palm upward and the fingers splayed open. His hands are giant, his wrist as thick as a stalk of fleshy kelp. Blood is streaked on his forearm. Lines painted black lead to the cut she observed that night. It lies like a swollen fruit. The lips of the wound have not sealed and the flesh has risen up, swallowing the stitches so that they are now cutting into the skin. Intrigued, she steps out of the tank he has built, placing her new foot on the mountain. Quietly she steps toward him, watching for his waking, but he is dead to the world. She crouches next to him and brings her face close to the wound. Infection. She can smell it. The flesh is red and purple. She closes her eyes and feels the pulse of heat spreading from it to the beat of his heart. She places her hand over it. He moans. She tastes the sound of that moan, letting it circulate inside her. She opens her eyes and again studies the cut. She touches the lips of it with her fingers, taking in the spikes of gut caught in the swollen flesh, pricking her skin. And then she trails her fingers down the flesh of his forearm, to the branch of his wrist, to the yam of his swollen hand. She puts her face to his fingers, studying them. They too are swollen. From work, the infection, and dehydration. The nail of his thumb has been ripped in two by his hammer. The pads of his fingers and palm are alternately shredded or worked to leather. She sees these swollen fingers and imagines this beast trying to sew his own arm together. She giggles to herself. She goes to explore his camping place. Her eyes feast on everything he has brought. Every tool, every twist of wire, every clamp and every shred of cloth dragged across a mountain. What a strange creature, she thinks, turning to look at him. He is nothing like her love. Jono is gentle. Even his hunting is done with grace, and his heart is one of peace. This man, she looks at his scars, and she hears his moaning. He is driven by a storm, while Jono is driven by a breeze. Even from here she can feel the heat of the wound. She turns to his equipment and searches through it. She remembers many of these items from her day in the boy's hut, and she remembers how he had repaired his stitches after she had ripped them open. She searches through the piles of all he has brought, the boxes and tools and rope and tarp and wood, hammer and saw and brush and bucket, until finally she sees what she is looking for, lying on top of a red tin box, the one that stood outside her love's door. A silver blade with a blue handle. She picks it up and returns to the sleeping man. She eyes the smooth of his neck beneath his ear, where an artery pulses. How easy it would be to cut his throat. She places the blade there, watching the soft throbbing beneath the steel. And she remembers. Let him suffer. She crouches again to his wound. She extends the blade under the moon and sinks it into the swollen lips, pressing against the steel of the strands of gut and feeling the release as one after another parts under the knife. The man groans as the wound pops open. She knows he will not wake, even though his groans deepen and his body twitches. She watches the wound empty itself and listens as the breathing of the man evens. What a strange creature, she thinks, looking on this being so alone in the mountains.